Almost there. Oh, clickety click. Almost there. Every now and then it just seems to slow to a crawl when making the basic selections, but that's just about got it done. There. All right. So the live stream is up and running. Now we just have to wait for other people to show up. And that, I think we're going to want to zoom in a little bit more on. I know I wouldn't be happy trying to read the small text. And I've got my big screen, so if other people are looking at a small screen, that's just going to be hard. Afternoon, Aaron.
Hey, Rabbi.
How are you doing?
Good. How about you?
I'm doing all right.
Are we going to have live Mishnah next week?
Well, that's our discussion at the end of today's class. So I will be in the building next week, but because we're beginning religious school by then. And the question will be whether or not people are ready to come back in live, whether they're, well, it also depends on whether we finish Yevamot tonight. If people want a break, if people want to press on and pick a new Masechet, then that's something we're going to talk at the end, because that way, hopefully, we'll have the largest number of people joining us. So those are things to keep percolating in the back of your mind. All right, well, we are at 7:03, which I think is more than fair for a start time. So why don't we go ahead and get things underway? Hold on, just let me click that. And we will begin by doing a little bit of a review, because Mishnah 10 of chapter 15 builds very much on Mishnah 9. And I know we only did it last week, but it was last week. So I'm not willing to guarantee that everybody is fully up to speed on what we did. So last week we were talking about the issue where somebody has gone overseas, and while they're overseas, their status changed. A child was born, their husband died. What order did these things happen? And whether or not we can rely upon the testimony of the person returning. So we saw that generally speaking, the testimony would be acceptable as long as it didn't contradict anything that we already knew. And if it did contradict what we knew, we would still take it into consideration, even as we try to resolve the situation. And we're going to get something similar in chapter 15, Mishnah 10. So let's go ahead and take a look at it and see how it's working. All right, so if she said, meaning the woman who returns with information, the Yavam was born for me overseas. That is, when the family left the country, her husband did not have a brother, and she claims that in the meantime, a brother was born to her husband. Right, let's just make sure we all realize what's going on, because we're not used to families having such a wide gap of children. What she is saying is that when she left, she went overseas, and her mother-in-law, her husband's mother, had another kid. So she now has a Yavam. She now has a brother-in-law, which, in the situation we're dealing with, when her husband dies, leaving no children, would be the person that she would expect to marry. So the question is, this Yavam was born overseas. When she left, there wasn't a brother, but while they were there, a brother was born. Now, this is not as unusual as it might sound. I know that we are used to families being, a kid born every 2 years, and after maybe 4 or 5, maybe we stop. And even if you have 10 kids, it would be unusual for the oldest to already be married when the youngest is being born. However, in the ancient world, that was not impossible. And it wasn't impossible for all of the children that might have been born in the meantime between the eldest and the youngest to have passed away, so that the eldest was an only child when they left, but while abroad, the mother-in-law had another child, meaning the husband had a new brother. So that's the situation we're dealing with. It is not at all impossible. It's not at all even strange in many households where people get married young and have lots of kids. And that's the situation we're dealing with. So that's what the first piece of information she brought, that this brother was born while they were away. And she also said, my husband died, or else we wouldn't be dealing with this issue. And afterward, my Yavam died. Or my Yavam died, and afterward, my husband died. In either case, she is deemed credible. This is because when she left, she was not presumed to require levirate marriage, and the suggestion that her husband now has a brother is based solely on her testimony. Right? So the only reason that we even know there might have been this other brother who had been born was because she brought back that information. She could have kept her mouth shut and avoided this whole complication. The fact that she did shows that we are willing to give a lot of credence to this. And because there was no child when she left, we also are not challenging the original assumptions of the family. As we're going to see, if there was a Yavam when they left, we're going to have to deal with this a little differently. But for the moment, and I'm about to sneeze. Excuse me. But for the moment, in this situation, she is believed. Yes, Aaron.
So, Rabbi, this Mishnah assumes that they learned about the newly born brother from the Yevamot, right?
Yes, from the widow. She is the one who brought back the information.
All right. If they found out some other way, this doesn't count then, right?
If they found out some other way, if it was widely known in the community or known at all prior to her testimony, then it will be what we're going to see in part 2 of the Mishnah. So let's take a look at part 2. However, if she went, she and her husband and her Yavam overseas, meaning that when she left, she already had this brother-in-law. So it was her and the brother-in-law and all of that. And upon her return, she said, my husband died, and afterwards my Yavam died, or my Yavam died and afterwards my husband died. She is not deemed credible, as a woman is not deemed credible if she says, my Yavam died, in order that she may marry another man. Now, this is considered to be a possible case of encouraging a person to perjure themselves, that we suspect, possibly, and enough suspicion, that she is making up the story about her Yavam being dead because she doesn't want to be bound to him, either because she doesn't like him or because she'd rather marry someone else, and the Yavam is not available to dissolve the relationship and allow her to get married to someone else. So her testimony is not deemed to be credible in and of itself. If we know that there was a brother-in-law, the brother to the deceased, then without additional testimony, we have to work from that assumption. So that puts her in a bad position. It's good to get more information, more testimony, which, by the way, is what chapter 16 is going to be a lot about.
So, Rabbi,
yes,
if the Yevamot, if the new brother actually died and they knew about it, they knew about the brother before she said he died, she potentially could be tied to him for her entire life?
Unfortunately, yes. Now, chapter 16, like I said, which we're about to begin after this, is going to deal with many of the questions of testimony regarding the death of another person. So right now we are in a very isolated, extreme hypothetical where her husband and her brother-in-law left, and only she returns, and the only information we have about what happened is her own testimony. And in that circumstance, her testimony is not sufficient to free her. So yes, even though it is entirely possible that the Yavam indeed did die, and therefore there is no one for her to perform a levirate marriage with, or to do chalitza with, and discharge her relationship without evidence, which is what chapter 16 is going to talk about, she would be stuck. All right. So again, as we've been saying since chapter 1 of Yevamot, which seems like it was so long ago that we began, we should not be happy with all of the outcomes. We should not be happy with all of the resolutions. The rabbis are not holding up things as being the ideal or preferred outcome. They are holding up the legal implications when the events happen exactly as described in the Mishnah. This is a way to encourage people to prevent it from happening like this, either finding more testimony, or, as we talked about before, writing conditional gets and other types of, what's the other word? Based on the Tanai, it's conditional. Yeah, writing conditional gets so that when you are engaged in risky actions, whether it be going off to war or whether it be traveling, which especially in the ancient world was always tricky, that you would not end up with this kind of problem. And that was the preferred resolution for these types of issues. But if none of that happened, with our best of intentions and best desire to help her in her difficult situation, we do also have to be realists that the allowance of the limited testimony was only given in circumstances where there wasn't a overwhelming suspicion that perhaps somebody was lying. And in this particular case, because of the nature of yibum, of levirate marriage, that's too much of a real possibility to allow the extraordinary exception of normally letting one person testify about their own condition. And so forth. And she is not deemed credible if she says that her sister died in order that she may enter the house of her husband. So this is a different situation, but in similar fashion, if a woman says, oh, I was on a trip with my sister and she died, so now I can get married to her husband because, you know, he's a widower. And normally, of course, two sisters are not allowed to be married to the same man in the lifetime of each other. We also are a little suspicious about that type of thing. And likewise, a man is not deemed credible if he says, my brother died, so that he may enter into levirate marriage with his brother's wife. And he is not deemed credible when he says that his wife died, in order that he may marry his wife's sister. The sages accepted impaired testimony of this kind only when there was a concern about creating a situation of a deserted wife. So they have this additional barrier, and as you can see, it does impact both male and female testimony under these extraordinary circumstances. All right, questions before we jump into chapter 16, the final chapter of the Masechet Yevamot. Okay.
Rabbi, I have a question.
Yes.
I hear that in some isolated community, they're still practicing this.
So levirate marriage is still practiced in the community by its absence. So, for example, even in the conservative movement, if somebody was getting married, if a woman was going to get married, and she said, my husband died, my first husband died, I asked, well, when your first husband died, did you have any children? And if she says no, then my second question is, and did he have a brother? And if the answer is yes, then we perform chalitza. Now, I have not had that situation yet in my rabbinate, but I do know of my colleagues who have. And the process of chalitza, which we looked at in earlier chapters, is done. What we don't do in the modern world is go through with the actual levirate marriage. That we don't make her marry the brother, but we do make the ceremony to release her from that brother, so that they can that she can then get married to the man of her choice. If anybody is actually forcing people to go through with a levirate marriage, or I guess force is probably the wrong word, because the Mishnah is very clear that you can't force. If the brothers are not willing to go through with it, then the chalitza happens very clearly. But if the people wish to go through with it, as far as I know, in every mainstream Jewish group, it is not allowed for people to go through with it. However, this being the modern world and the wonderful world of the internet is out there, I wouldn't be surprised if there were some groups that were a little strange and a little twisted in their interpretations, that are kind of making up their own rules. That's been a feature of the last 100 years, and it's gotten kind of worse over the last 20.
Rabbi, I thought under this they could force the woman to go through with the levirate marriage. I didn't think the woman could refuse. I thought only the guy could refuse.
So she cannot refuse in the ancient world where levirate marriage. I'm sorry. The other thing that's gotten worse is spam calls. She would not be able to refuse if one of the brothers wished to marry her, but the pressure to be divorced from him would be rather extreme. So there would still eventually be a resolution that allows her to be free and marry whomever she wishes.
And what kind of pressure could they have to force a divorce, though?
You underestimate the pressure of the classical courts. We've talked a little bit before about the idea of just basic cherem, of putting someone under a ban. No one will speak to them. They'll not have an honor in the synagogue. No one will do business to them, all the way up to including fines, imprisonment, and physical beatings to force compliance.
Oh, they had imprisonment?
Oh, yes. It depended at different times in our history on what the host nation allowed us to do.
No, I was talking about the time of the Mishnah. So.
Oh, yes. Prison wasn't a common form of punishment, but as a temporary form of convincing, it was possible.
Oh, so it's like civil contempt.
Again, not being 100% familiar with how that works in the American court of law. If you mean holding someone in jail until they comply with a court order,
yeah,
then yes, that would be a good comparison. I'm always very cautious with technical terms in modern American legalese, because although I know a little, I know just enough to know that I don't know enough. And I don't want to give a false equivalency if there isn't one.
But Rabbi, how can they sanction you if you're following the rule of law?
Because the community can often apply pressure when you may be following the letter of the law, but you are not behaving according to the spirit of the law. As we've talked before about the issue of annulment of Hafka'at Kedushin, that is built entirely upon the premise, the section in the Talmud that discusses it, of a husband deliberately abusing his authority under the letter of the law to divorce and then revoke a divorce before it's been delivered multiple times as a way of tormenting his potential ex-wife. And the rabbis say, no, we're not going to let him abuse the law in a way that lets him abuse her. So we will simply dissolve the relationship.
Right. But this is I thought this was a little different, because the Torah actually prescribes the levirate marriage. And I remember when you talked about the standard of the community or the morals of the community, is there a difference between a court taking actions based on the standards of the community versus the court taking action based on the law, assuming you're not trying to abuse the law?
Right. So the court would not consider those to be two different categories. If you have actually violated the law, then of course the court is going to punish, adjudicate, rule against you according to the law. If you have kept the law but violated its spirit, then the court will deal with that as is necessary and is considered appropriate in its judgment.
All right.
All right. So let's move on to chapter 16, because if we're quick, we can actually finish all of Yevamot tonight and then talk about what we're doing going forward. If not, then maybe we'll go forward with a little bit more Yevamot and have a little more time to think about it. Let's see what happens. Chapter 16, Mishnah 1. In the case of a woman whose husband and rival wife traveled to a country overseas, and witnesses came and told her, your husband died, she shall not marry any other man, in case she requires levirate marriage with her brother-in-law, her Yavam, in which case she is prohibited from marrying anyone else. So as we have heard before, that the issue would be that the husband and the rival wife were overseas, and when the witnesses come and give the report that the husband is dead, she's not 100% sure whether or not the levirate marriage is needed. What is the outstanding issue? Well, she shall not enter into levirate marriage until she knows whether she, meaning the rival wife, is pregnant. If her rival wife bears a child to her late husband, she does not have a levirate bond with her brother-in-law, and she is prohibited from marrying him. As we saw earlier on in the Masechet, if the woman is pregnant at the time of his death, that child is considered to be from the first husband, and therefore no levirate marriage is needed. And that goes whether it is from her or whether it is from another one of his wives. So she is not free from levirate bond, and she also can't rush into the levirate bond until what's going on with her rival wife, her potential pregnancy, is resolved, meaning we've waited long enough to be sure that she's not pregnant. Situation number 2, if she had a mother-in-law overseas, but her late husband had no brothers, she need not be concerned that a brother to her husband may have been born. Meaning that if the husband was overseas and her mother-in-law was also overseas, and her husband, we get report that her husband is dead, she doesn't have to say, I wonder if my mother-in-law got pregnant and had a kid before my husband died, but nobody has brought me news of that yet. That is not a concern. That is too distant of an abstract hypothetical, and she has no reason to be suspicious of her mother-in-law having given birth unless it has been informed that she has given birth. But if her mother-in-law departed from her town pregnant, meaning there is reason to believe there might have been a child born, this widow should be concerned that perhaps her late husband now has a brother with whom she is obligated in levirate marriage, meaning that further investigation will be needed before she can be considered free and clear of the obligation.
Rabbi.
Yes.
I thought I saw a statement in there. It has to be a boy that's born for her not to be obligated for the levirate marriage, right? If it's a girl, is she still obligated?
You mean if the mother-in-law gave birth to a girl?
Yeah.
She is not obligated to levirate marriage because she wouldn't have been allowed to marry the girl. Primarily because that would not allow there to be a offspring from the deceased husband.
Strike that. I mean, all right. That's what I mean. The question I was thinking about, if he had a daughter, though, that doesn't count. They still have to do levirate marriage, right?
You mean if the deceased husband had a girl?
Yeah.
No, then she is off the hook.
All right.
If they have any children of any type, then she is not considered to be bound by levirate marriage.
All right.
It's not only if there's a son. Now, Rabbi Yoshua, he has a different opinion. He says, even in such a case, meaning where the mother-in-law is known to be pregnant when she left, she need not be concerned and may marry whomever she wishes. He doesn't actually win this argument, but his argument was, look, we can just have too many hypotheticals. The majority, however, hold that it's not so hypothetical when we know she was pregnant, which means there is a 50-50 chance if she had the child and he came to term, that there is a levirate bond with the infant. Therefore, we do need to investigate further. Questions? All right, so let's try Mishnah number 2. If there are 2 sister-in-laws married to 2 childless brothers, who testify about their marital status. And this one says, my husband died, and that one says, my husband died. Although each one of them is deemed credible with regard to her own status as a widow, this one is prohibited from marrying due to the possibility that the husband of the other sister may be alive, obligating her in levirate marriage. And that one is prohibited from marrying due to the husband of this sister, according to the same rationale. Although each is accorded credibility as to her own husband's death, the halacha is that sisters-in-law are among the 5 types of women not accorded credibility with regard to each other's permissibility to marry because of possible conflicts of interest, as we saw quite a while ago. So because they are 2 sister-in-law, and each of them brings back evidence or testimony rather that their own husband died, but nothing about each other's, then each one is technically a widow, but also technically bound by the obligation of levirate marriage. That seems paradoxical, as we've encountered in a few other cases, of how can they be considered both widows, because that would mean both husbands are dead. But it's because their testimony only has standing with regard to their own status. And since each of them are dependent upon the husband of their other sister-in-law to discharge a levirate obligation, that part of their obligation cannot be cleared based off the testimony of the sister-in-law. So they are stuck, they are trapped because they lack enough information to each be freed completely from the levirate marriage. They are considered widows, but they're not considered completely unbound from this obligation.
Rabbi,
Yes.
how come they can't force a separation based on the fact that the husband's not providing the required support?
So again, there are always ways to try and solve these types of things. But there are particular issues in levirate marriage that are sticky, which is to say that the bond doesn't actually make the brother-in-law her husband. They are betrothed, but they are not fully bound together. And so it's a little bit harder to do an annulment of the relationship under those circumstances.
Right. Sorry. But don't they only have a certain amount of time to complete the levirate marriage? Because it said it should be done without delay.
It should be done without delay, but if the delay is the brother-in-law is not there, that's not a willing delay. That's an unpreventable delay. If you knew that the brother-in-law was on a business trip, traveling, to India from Israel, then you wouldn't expect him back for a year. And she would have to wait until he came back and made a decision. Yes, I will marry her, or no, we'll do chalitza. It's only if he's there that he's not allowed to just sit on the decision.
But even the brother-in-law is supposed to have permission to leave for so long before he's even allowed to. It seems like if they exceeded too long, wouldn't that give constructive notice something's wrong?
Well, so that's where we're going to get into about evidence of somebody's death with no actual eyewitness testimony, which is going to come later on in this chapter. But in general, Judaism is not a big fan of that kind of circumstantial evidence of just saying, well, if he was really dead, he'd probably be back by now. We're very, very reluctant to make those leaps of logic, which you're right, it creates problems. Problems, again, that can be avoided before a person leaves for that kind of dangerous trip. Let's go ahead and finish off this Mishnah because there are more ins and outs that might come up that need to be handled as a block. If this one has witnesses to her husband's death, and that one does not have witnesses, meaning one of the sister-in-laws actually did have witnesses to her husband's death, but the other one didn't, meaning for their own husbands, then the one who has witnesses is prohibited from marrying, as there are no witnesses to the death of her Yavam, her brother-in-law, to exempt her from levirate marriage, but the one who has no witnesses is permitted to marry based on her own testimony that her husband died, combined with the witness's testimony exempting her from levirate marriage about the death of her brother-in-law. So you might think, hey, we've got witnesses, but technically the witnesses to one woman's death, one woman's husband's death, frees the sister-in-law, not the actual wife, because it was their additional testimony on her death that means that the sister-in-law is not bound by levirate marriage. Likewise, if this one has children and that one has no children, meaning one sister-in-law has kids, one doesn't, then the one with children is permitted to marry, as she herself is deemed credible with regard to her husband's death, and her children exempt her from levirate marriage. But the one without children is prohibited from marrying, as the death of the Yavam has not been corroborated independently of her sister-in-law's testimony, and because she doesn't have children, there is still the potential for the levirate bond. If there were two additional Yevamim If there were two additional Yevamim with whom these two widows entered into levirate marriage, and then the Yevamim died childless, the women are prohibited from marrying, since the concern about an additional living Yavam still remains. So even if they were beginning to go through the levirate marriage with other local brothers who were still alive and able to get married, if they died, we're still worried that there is this other mystery dead person who potentially could be alive to do levirate marriage, and they go back to being prohibited to anyone else. Now, Rabbi Elazar disagrees. Rabbi Elazar says, since these women were permitted to marry the living brother-in-laws, the additional Yevamim who were alive and well and home, as the testimony of each was deemed credible with regard to her own status, they are permitted from then on to marry any man, because their statements, taken together, indicate that neither one is obligated to enter into levirate marriage. So Rabbi Elazar holds that once they are able to move forward in the process by marrying the additional brothers-in-law that were home, that creates a new set of circumstances, and we no longer need to be concerned about the potential of the, well, we think dead because we let them get married, but we don't have confirmation, so they would obligate each other. But since they've gotten remarried with the other levirate brothers at home, we've moved past that point, and therefore it's no longer a concern. At least that's Rabbi Elazar's position. He, by the way, does lose that argument. That we don't get to just pretend like the issue of testimony regarding the death of the other brothers is no longer relevant. Questions or comments? I know this is complicated. And I know it may not seem very relevant, but you'll be happy to know that we're moving into more relevant issues that still have very much modern applications. It's just in a very tragic situation. We've been talking consistently about the death of these men overseas or the death of other people overseas. But what evidence counts as evidence of a death? What do you actually have to witness to know that a person is dead? And that is something that unfortunately still is very relevant. As I mentioned, this became a big issue at 9/11 when so many Jewish people perished in the Twin Towers and the airplane and the Pentagon. And dealing with all of the doubt that surrounded it took quite some time to clarify and be able to free any widows as no longer being bound to their husbands that were presumed dead. So all of this does still have relevance, and even on small scales, there are still times when a person can go missing, and this is still used. Thank God I've never had to adjudicate a case like this in my own career, and God willing, I'll never have to. But it does exist as a modern concern because disappearances can happen. All right, so Mishnah number 3. One may testify that a man died only if he can testify about seeing the countenance, the partsuf, of the face with the nose, as this allows one to identify the individual with certainty. Although there are distinguishing marks, what we call simanim, on his body and his personal belongings, which appear to indicate his identity, one may not rely on these as identification. So let's make sure we're seeing the different situations that are being saying okay and not okay. So it's if you see the part of the face that has the nose and the person is dead, then you can absolutely give testimony saying, Mr. Cohen is dead. I saw his face. He wasn't breathing. He was crushed under a rock. He was cut in half. And we're going to be a little graphic in just a second, so you might as well get ready for it. I saw his face. He's dead. On the other hand, if you say, well, I saw the body buried under the rocks and it was wearing his clothes or it had his shoes on, but you couldn't see the face because that was the part that was buried under the rocks, then that is not good enough. Even if you say it had the birthmark on his leg, that's not good enough. We need for you to be able to see the face in the ideal situation for testifying about somebody passing away, because it's certainly possible for there to be mistakes about the clothing or about personal effects or other marks on the body. Without the face, it is impossible to be 100% sure that that is the person. By the way, you may also know that in the modern world, when it comes time to identify a body that has been brought to the morgue, they don't just hand you the wallet and personal effects and say, did these belong to Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so? They still show the face from somebody who can testify that this is indeed the person. I don't know exactly what that full standing is under American law, because we have other ways to identify with fingerprints, dental records, and such. But in classical Jewish law, the face was everything. All right. Additionally, or furthermore, as our translation gives it, one may not testify that a person died until his soul actually departs. And even if one saw him cut open and severely wounded, or crucified, or with a wild animal eating parts of him, he may not testify that he died. So if you
Sorry,
see
Rabbi, for interruption.
yeah.
No, because I'm in between. I have 30 seconds to ask something. And what happens if the face is totally disfigured and you cannot recognize it?
All right, so then we move into part B about trying to establish the person's death, but that's going to be in some of the later Mishnahs. So there are backups, excuse me, in logical faction, which is not always something we can rely on with the Mishnah's organization style. They're giving us sort of the ideal circumstance, right? If you want to say, I saw so-and-so dead, this is what you need to say. If you can't say this, then we're going to need additional ways to identify whether or not the person was dead. But this is the clearest cut way to make that testimony. And without this evidence, then we have to move to plan B. But plan A requires all of these elements, that you have to testify that you saw the face, and you have to testify that you saw them die. You can't testify that you saw them dying. If you say, well, the Romans were crucifying him and I couldn't stand it, so I left before he was dead, your testimony is not 100% reliable. Maybe he was cut down, right? Maybe he was let go. Maybe something else happened and he's still alive. If you didn't see the death, then you can't testify that the person is dead. Even if you say, I saw a lion drag him off into the bushes and he hasn't come back yet, if he was still alive when the lion took him, and that was the last time you saw him, then yes, we're going to have good grounds for going to plan B and other backup, but we can't just say you saw him dead. And on top of that, additionally, one may testify to someone's death only when the body was witnessed up to 3 days following death and not after that, since the appearance may change due to decomposition. If you want to identify a body, you need to be able to identify the body. And the body changes after a few days in ways that could render it unrecognizable. And the potential there is reason enough for us to be worried if you didn't see it early enough. Now, Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava says one cannot establish general guidelines for this matter because not every person, not every place, nor every hour is identical, meaning decomposition is not uniform. It occurs in different rates or at different rates in different situations. If you are in the middle of a desert, if you are frozen in the glacier, it may take a lot longer before your features become indistinguishable. And if you are in the middle of a swamp, it may happen even faster. However, the position of the Rabbim, the majority, is not with Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. We don't identify it conditionally. Instead, we say 3 days, no more. Why? Because otherwise we open up an additional can of worms on exactly whether or not the circumstances under which you saw the body would be reasonable to say that it was still unchanged significantly. And that then becomes an additional layer of analysis and more likely argument and controversy. As we've seen throughout this entire Masechet, all 15 previous chapters, whether or not a person is dead is a big deal. It has huge ramifications for the rest of the family. And those are legal ramifications, whether or not there was levirate marriage, whether or not people can get married to other people that they wish to, whether or not inheritance laws begin to be implemented. Death is not merely a cause of grief, it is also a cause for many different legal changes. And so the rabbis were not willing to introduce additional uncertainty into the midst of what was already a difficult situation. All right, so that is plan A. If you want to give honest testimony where you stand up in the court and say, I swear I saw this, what you had to see was the face, including the nose, not just the eyes, right? The actual part of the face that has the nose in it, so the center of the face, so you get the full features. You had to see the person actually die, and you had to see the body, and not actually see them die, excuse me, you had to actually see the body dead, whether you saw them die or whether you came after they died. That's not the problem, as long as you didn't show up after 3 days. So that is what lets you testify 100% without controversy that the person is dead. All right. Mishnah 4 throws a wrench into it. What happens in other situations? And the most classic example of that is water. If a man fell into the water and did not come out, right? Somebody disappears into a lake, into a river, into an ocean. What do? If a man fell into the water and did not come out, whether the body of water has a visible end or does not have a visible end, meaning whether you can see the shore or not, are you in the middle of the ocean or are you on the edge of a lake? His wife is prohibited from remarrying. There is no absolute proof that the man died, as it is possible that he reemerged from the water some distance away, right? If we can't see every place where he might have come out, then he might have come out where we can't see. Now, this is the opinion of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir said, indeed, an incident occurred involving a certain person who fell into the great cistern and emerged only after 3 days. Right? This is evidence that sometimes one may survive a fall into water, even when everyone assumes he is dead. So that's his position. Rabbi Yossi, who's speaking on behalf of the majority, said, an incident occurred involving a blind man who descended into to immerse for ritual purity in a cave, to go into the natural waters of the cave, and his guide descended after him, and they disappeared, and they remained long enough for their souls to have departed, and the sages permitted their wives to marry because they had disappeared into the water and not emerged. So Rabbi Yossi brings a counter example, a counter incident, an anecdote of not just where this happened, where a person went into the water and died, or rather disappeared, but that the sages ruled that the wife of the blind man and the wife of the guide were allowed to remarry because there was no potential for them to have emerged from the water. Is everybody following that logic? Okay, so there was another incident involving water, another incident in Asya, in which they lowered a certain man into the sea on a rope, and when they pulled the rope back to land, only his leg came up in their hands. So maybe they had the rope tied around his leg, he goes in, and they pull back the rope, and they only get a leg. And they were not certain whether he was alive or dead. They've only got a leg. What do you make of that evidence? The sages said, if his leg was cut from the knee and above, his wife may marry, as he did not survive, as he could not survive, really should say, such a wound. If his leg was cut only from the knee and below, she may not marry until there is additional evidence that he is actually dead. The concern, of course, is that if it is a high enough wound that he would be dead, if not immediately, at least quite soon. In the Talmud, they talk about a year's worth of waiting to make sure that he doesn't reemerge, because a wound of this magnitude would kill anybody within a year. Now, the modern world, we've got different healthcare and better options, so that's not entirely applicable in its literal interpretation, but the general principle is the same, meaning that collecting the material remains of the deceased in a way that indicates that if we have, for example, a quantity of brain, then we know that the person is deceased, because you don't go on living without that. If you find only the heart, we can render the person as being dead, because you don't go on living without that. If you find a finger but nothing else, then we would not say that that person is definitely dead, because it is entirely possible to lose a finger, even in an accidental and uncontrolled manner, and still live. So this does still have ramification for the identification of people who have potentially died in tragic ways where we do not have the ability to collect all of their remains. Unfortunately, this does happen in issues of terrorism in particular. In Israel, there are teams of people whose sacred task is to collect every piece that they can find of those who have been killed in some of the horrible explosions that have been rendered as these acts of murder, and to collect them both for burial as well as for identification. Hopefully that's the kind of thing that will someday no longer be a thing. Mishnah 5. Now we're going to get what you might think is even more hearsay evidence, but we'll talk about why this is considered reliable when we get to the end. Even if one heard from the women, meaning just the chit-chat gossip, who were saying, so-and-so died, this is sufficient in order to testify to his death. Rabbi Yehuda says, even if one heard from the children who were saying, we are going to eulogize and bury so-and-so, that is also sufficient. Furthermore, one may rely upon someone mentioning that a man died, regardless of whether the speaker intends to testify and thereby allow the man's wife to remarry, or whether he does not intend to offer formal testimony. Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava says, with regard to a Jew who offers this information, it may be relied upon even if he intends for his statement to be considered formal testimony. However, with regards to a Gentile, if he intended to testify, his testimony is not considered valid testimony. His statement is relied upon only when he does not intend to state it as formal testimony. So we'll get to that last very much counterintuitive phrase, but let's walk through why we take this weird hearsay evidence as being valid at all. So people are gossiping in the marketplace and saying, oh, isn't it a shame that Mr. Cohen died, blah, blah, blah. When you return back to your home, you can go to the court and say, I heard that they said he was dead, and that is considered to be testimony. Now, you can't swear that you saw the dead person, because you didn't. That was, remember, back up in our earlier Mishnah about what you'd have to see to say that. But you can say that you heard the people talking about his death, or even the children talking about it. Now, the reason why this is considered to be sufficient evidence is precisely what the middle begins to introduce. The idea that this information is being given casually, that this is being given in a non-formal way, meaning people are just talking. And if people are just talking, then you can presume that they are not deliberately trying to mislead whoever is hearing the statement. It's only when they begin to testify that it becomes questionable. However, as you can see from the middle of the Mishnah, that we do accept even if the person is intending to offer formal testimony. If you say, wait a minute, do you swear that what you saw is what you saw? Or do you swear that what you heard is what you heard? Even under those circumstances where we might consider this now potentially something a person might lie about because they know that their words have meaning rather than just it's a natural thing they've said, even then we still rely upon their words. Unless, as Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava says, they are not Jewish. If somebody is not Jewish and they are being deliberately asked to provide like evidence and testimony to have the legal ramification of certifying that a person is dead, then in the ancient world, we were absolutely unsure about the reliability of that testimony. The non-Jews, as we've come across in multiple Mishnayot, were not considered to be reliable or honest. And given their treatment of the Jewish people for much of our history, I think it's perfectly fair to understand why that was the opinion of the population. Aaron, question.
Yes, Rabbi. Back to the hearsay thing. Assuming they weren't, heard statements that weren't meant to be testimony, how do they know that the person giving those statements actually saw the face? In other words, when does inadmissible testimony become admissible through hearsay?
Okay, so with regards to the adults that are chatting about his death, that is considered to be good enough because people wouldn't say that he was dead without knowing that he was dead. That is the assumption. And you're right, that assumption is debatable, but the rabbis did establish that as our benchmark. On the other hand, with regards to the children, there is actually a discussion in the Talmud that with regards to the children, you should ask them for a little bit more information and be sure that they know what they're talking about, that you can't just go off overhearing them, but you should say, so what happened at the grave, what was going on with the coffin, what did people mention about the person in the eulogies, that you should probe a little bit more to make sure that what they are talking about seems to be right. So you're right. It's not a perfect system. That's why this is the backup. And it's why there is a little unease and why they'd obviously prefer to have the other form of testimony.
Because you can eulogize somebody even if you didn't see the face, right?
Well, the great phrase of reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated is something that we can bear in mind. Indeed, it's possible, and it has happened, that eulogies have been published before a person actually died. The most famous case that I know of was for Nobel, the man who created the Nobel Prize, because when they accidentally published his eulogy before he was actually dead, it talked about how he had invented dynamite and was responsible for the murder of millions of people through war. He decided he didn't want that to be his legacy, and so he went and invented the Nobel Prize in order to give away much of his money for worthwhile endeavors across human society. So yes, it is possible. And that's, again, why they would be asking for a little bit more detail. But at a certain point, if the only information you have is that the people are talking about the guy being dead and there's no way to dig him up and check, then that became sufficient. Now, it might be strange because we've been looking for higher bars of evidence in many other situations. But as we've seen throughout Yevamot, especially the last couple chapters, the rabbis really did want to prevent the case of somebody being dead and buried, but still considered alive with regards to his wife.
Right.
And so they are willing to accept this impaired testimony.
Yeah. The only thing I thought that was unusual is that the rabbis want to know if you saw their face, but in hearsay testimony, which is secondhand testimony, they don't want to know if the people saying it, who you overheard, actually saw the face. So it's basically
Right.
inadmissible testimony becoming admissible through hearsay.
That's exactly right. And it's because of that short stop in Casual Town. That is what's being discussed here. Because it's being talked about in a casual way, that gives it more standing than somebody who would come with inadequate formal testimony saying, I saw his foot, but nothing else.
So the court could potentially reject my testimony, and then other people hear me talk about the death, and then have that same testimony become admissible.
I don't know whether that particular loophole would be worthwhile. I've not heard of that particular attempt to circumvent this. But we got just a couple more Mishnayot, all dealing with the same general topic. So let's go ahead and finish those off. Well, one at a time, and we'll see if we can't clarify things anymore. So if you thought that one was a bit hearsay, wait till you see number 6. Witnesses may testify that an individual died even if they saw his corpse only by candlelight or by moonlight. Normally not the best lighting, but it is considered sufficient. And the court may allow a woman to marry based on the statement of a disembodied voice proclaiming that her husband died. Now, this is a little confusing because the phrase that's used for disembodied voice here is a bat kol, and that is the synonym that's also used for a minor form of prophecy. This is not talking about a prophetic voice. This is talking about literally what we would call an echo, a voice that we heard without seeing the person. And we're going to get an example. There was an incident with regard to a certain individual who stood at the top of a mountain and said, so-and-so, son of so-and-so from such and such a place, died. They went and found no person there. But even so, they relied upon the statement and allowed the wife to marry, allowed the wife of the individual declared dead to marry. Likewise, and there was another incident in Salmon, a city in the Galil, where a particular man said, I am so-and-so, son of so-and-so, a snake bit me and I am dying. And they went and found his corpse, but could not recognize him. Yet they went ahead and allowed his wife to marry based on what he had said in his dying moments. So if you thought the gossipy chatter of the marketplace was a little bit of soft evidence, hearing a voice shout in the night or echo through the hills, I am dying, or so-and-so is dead, but not actually being able to meet the person to interrogate, probably sounds even more flimsy as far as evidence goes. However, this is considered to be adequate under these circumstances. So, questions or comments, as I wouldn't be surprised. Okay, so yeah, it's a little stunning, but again, it goes to show the lengths to which the rabbis will accept testimony on the death of a person. We live in an age of information, and I don't just mean the internet, I mean the age of record keeping and paperwork and all kinds of apparatus to try and ensure that every T is crossed, every I is dotted, that there are formal death certificates and inquests when needed and autopsies if necessary and fingerprints and dental and DNA. They didn't have that. And that put them in a position. They could either rule what you might consider stringently, meaning demanding the perfect amount of evidence in order to certify a person was dead. But to do so would be very lenient with regards to the rights of the wife and with regards to the rights of the heirs or anyone else that was waiting for the estate to be distributed. On the other hand, they could have gone completely, well, if he hasn't come back in 5 years, then we'll just declare him legally dead and everything will move on. And they didn't go that way either, because that would have been very lenient on calling someone dead without even the hint of evidence. Instead, they settled on a hint that if there is just enough information to make us think perhaps indeed he is dead, then with a little bit further investigation, with no sign of the fact that he is alive, checking around, making sure we can't get any evidence to the contrary, then they were willing to certify him dead under those circumstances. All right, let's take a look at the last Mishnah. Now, unfortunately, the last Mishnah, for some reason, in this particular edition, doesn't actually have all the English translation. I'm not quite sure why. They've got it all in the Hebrew, but when you scroll down, they begin sort of halfway through. There is an alternative translation also on Safaria, so I'm going to click over to that. And we're going to use the full translation because there's no way to really do it without actually reading all the words. So this is the same Mishnah that we just were on, number 7. It's just got all the English rather than part of the English. Rabbi Akiva said, when I went down to Nehardea to intercalate the year, I met Nehemiah of Beit Deli, who said to me, I heard that in the land of Israel, no one permits a married woman to marry again on the evidence of one witness, except Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. So Rabbi Akiva is traveling. He is helping them do the intercalation of the months, of doing the leap year system. Likely that this was done during the time when the authorities were cracking down on Judaism and preventing us from doing that. Excuse me. And the process of going down, he is having a conversation with this Nehemiah of Beit Deli. And he says, so I hear that in Israel, you guys are ruling very strictly. And in fact, nobody lets a woman get married on the evidence of one witness. The only person who allows that is Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. That is so, I told him. He said to me, tell them in my name, you know that this country is in confusion because of marauders. I have received a tradition from Rabban Gamliel the elder that they allow a married woman to remarry on the evidence of one witness. So he gives them a counter testimony, a counter account of the tradition that says, indeed, you can allow a woman to get remarried on the evidence of one witness. Now, he couldn't go himself because of the danger of the marauders, the violence that was around, but this he then passes on, transmits the tradition. And when I came and recounted the conversation in the presence of Rabban Gamliel, he rejoiced at my words and exclaimed, we have found a match for Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, meaning we have found someone else that can confirm what Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava was teaching. As a result of this talk, Rabban Gamliel remembered that some men were once killed at Tel Arza, and that Rabban Gamliel the elder had allowed their wives to marry again on the evidence of one witness. And the law was established that they allow a woman to marry again on the evidence of one witness, and on the evidence of one who states that he has heard from another witness, from a slave, from a woman, or from a female slave. So by reminding them of the teaching, it is confirmed from the other rabbi, and that allows them to say, we do have a confirmed tradition to allow them to get married by only one. Now, the hints are, through this Mishnah, that this was a time of great hardship and danger. That's why they were intercalating in this particular way, rather than the more traditional, and it's also why there were marauders around. So it's likely that men were being killed and women were being left widowed, and there weren't enough witnesses to many of the deaths to allow them to be out of their obligations to the deceased. So they are relieved to have an additional testimony, an additional tradition that allows them to implement this rule. Now, that last part, that you would allow it even on the evidence of one witness, the testimony of one who's heard from another, from a slave, from a woman, or from a female slave, which is all usually not considered good evidence. that then gets discussed. Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Joshua say a woman is not to be allowed to remarry on the evidence of one witness. Rabbi Akiva ruled a woman is not allowed to marry again on the evidence of a woman, on that of a slave, on that of a female slave, or on that of relatives. So they each have additional restrictions that we didn't see in that original statement. They said to him, it once happened that a number of Levites went to Tzoar, city of palms, and one of them became ill on the way, and they left him in the inn. When they returned, they asked the female innkeeper, where is our friend? And she replied, he is dead, and I buried him. And they allowed his wife to remarry. Should not then a priest's wife be believed at least as much as an innkeeper? Meaning, if we're going to take the evidence of one woman, why would we not take the evidence of other women? And this woman, the innkeeper, that was not always considered to be the most honest of professions. Innkeepers were often considered to be crooked because they were dealing with travelers, and therefore the opportunity to take advantage of them was greater. But even there, she was believed. And so they are arguing that we should accept the testimony of these other categories. He answered them, Rabbi Akiva rebutted, when she will give such evidence as the innkeeper gave, she will be believed. For the innkeeper had brought out to them the dead man's staff, his bag, and the Torah scroll, which he had with him. So she brings out the evidence, so to speak, and that corroborates her story. And his argument is, with that corroboration, then I would believe. Now, in the end, Rabbi Akiva loses this argument, and the halacha is what we saw earlier, meaning that the testimony of one, or one who's heard from another, or from a woman or a slave, is believed with regards to the death of a person in order to free the widow. And that brings us to the end of Yevamot.
Rabbi,
Yes.
wouldn't the innkeeper statement be considered casual conversation though, and not meant for testimony?
Well, certainly she wasn't thinking that she was giving formal testimony, but that's the point. This story is coming. Let me back up. I wish the Mishnah had. So this story is coming at the end of the Mishnah, as we've seen in many of our other Masechtot. The last section of Mishnah is often a very elegantly edited passage or story, and this one is the same. But really, this information would have been handy earlier on to establish that we allow testimony from the hearsay, from the slave, from the woman, or from female slave. It would have been nice if we had had that at the beginning of chapter 16 or 15. But they saved it here to show the argument. That doesn't mean that this is coming to change what we've already heard. In fact, this is coming to affirm what we have already heard. So it's not a challenge. It's more of just, and this is where you can see how they clarified this issue that we have clarified in the previous Mishnayot. And yes, if I were editing, I probably would have put it earlier, but then, I've got a very linear Western trained mind, and that's sometimes a good thing, and sometimes it's a really bad thing. So I'm not going to second guess the editing of the Mishnah. It's stuck around for a couple thousand years. I doubt anything I say or teach will. So they've got the presumption of knowing what they're doing. All right. Speaking of knowing what we're going to do, how's that for a segue? That's it for Yevamot. So we now have a couple options. We are a few weeks away from the high holidays, and once September begins, I always close down my evening classes to make time for additional high holiday preparation. And so that means from September, we won't be having Mishnah class, and we won't be having the Pathway to Judaism class on Thursdays. However, we still have a few weeks in August, and I will be continuing my Pathway class through August, but are people willing to begin a new Masechet, knowing that we're going to have to take like a month off for the month of Tishrei to go through all the Chagim, many of which are falling out on Wednesdays or Wednesday evenings. And we would be starting and then stopping and then starting again. The alternative would be to pick up again after Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah, after the end of the Yamim Noraim, and begin a Masechet from scratch then. I'm happy to start now because it's all the same to me, but I welcome your opinions. I've got a couple suggestions, but I'm always willing to hear other people's ideas. As you can see on my screen, we could do Mishnah Kritot, which deals with the topic of karet. Karet is the term that's often used as cut out in the Torah as a form of punishment. It is a complicated topic because, you know, it is Mishnah after all, but it's one that's often really misunderstood, and that might be an interesting issue to discuss. The other one I looked at that I thought we might be interested in is Mishnah Chulin. Chulin deals with issues of kashrut, literally the blood and guts of how kashrut works. It's a little technical, dealing with anatomy in places, but it's also quite interesting to see how kashrut works from the Mishnaic point of view. It's a little different than many of the stringencies that have been invented over the last couple thousand years. So that's also interesting if you're willing to wade through the technical details of anatomy. So do people have a preference for either of those or a completely different Masechet, or weigh in on the idea of doing our 3 weeks and then taking our break or postponing until after high holidays?
I always in favor to study all the time. Every week is important. Every week that you add more knowledge is always welcome. So I don't like to waste time.
Keeping momentum is a good thing. I agree.
Yeah, I'm
Which
with
one do you
Matan.
have in mind?
Which one's shorter or easier to do? I think we should go with the shorter or easier one, since we're only doing 3 weeks at a time.
I believe Kritot is shorter, but it's not short enough that we're going to finish it in 3 weeks. And yeah, Chulin is twice as long in terms of the number of chapters. I didn't measure exactly how long each of the passages are, because chapters can be misleading, but I'm willing to bet that Kritot is significantly shorter. Kritot also has the advantage that when we begin, as it is such a sober topic, it does fit very much thematically with the period of Elul, of reflection on life and death and our behavior. It certainly is thematically appropriate for the next few weeks leading into high holidays.
Rabbi, could we, I hate to keep bringing this up, but in the next 3 weeks, it wouldn't be a good idea to do Talmud, would it?
No, definitely not. Because when it comes time to change gears and do a Talmud shiur, either as a change or even just as a short-term break, I want to be able to try and prepare that, because the way the Talmudic argumentation works is much more complicated. It's like the difference between using a computer and building a computer. It's not too hard to use a computer. Building a computer requires opening up the case. And that's something that I want to introduce to a lot of people very carefully, rather than just reading it out flat like we've been doing with the Mishnah.
And also, I believe that there's circles, okay? When you build something, knowledge, first the core, the Tanakh, then the Mishnah, and the Talmud is when you have already a background of Mishnah and Torah, you can understand better and go more in depth.
It's true. I mean, I don't believe that you should wait until you have studied and memorized all of Mishnah before you learn Bavli, before you learn Talmud. But the more Mishnah you know, the better, the easier it'll be to understand Talmud when you get there. It'll be much more meaningful and clear.
I was going to suggest this is maybe another topic that can be discussed, maybe a class on the history of the people behind the Mishnah, and provide a historical perspective of the Mishnah.
A historical class, you know, that's interesting. I'm not sure I'd want to do it at this time slot, because the people who make the time for this slot generally are here for Mishnah itself, but doing a supplemental class, you know, one or two classes on the topic of the history of the Mishnah and the people involved in it, that could work. But that would have to wait until after high holidays. It's easier for me to prepare Mishnah than it is for me to create a new curriculum from scratch. Well, so let's go ahead then, and we'll go with Kritot. We'll start next week.
Which
we'll be
one,
back at
sorry? Which
Uh,
Masechet?
Kritot.
Klitot.
Yes. You've always wanted to know what karet is.
Can you please, Rabbi, write this in the WhatsApp group?
Sure. You mean so you have a record of it?
Because I'm driving and I will forget.
Ah,
But
I've
be
done that.
careful. Be careful.
Look,
Yes,
every minute that I have is for studying. Okay, I was showing
I know
houses, and in the middle I was studying a Mishnah.
that's nice, but make sure that you're still being safe, because you will have many more minutes to study if you're driving safe than if you're not. All right, so yes, I'll send this to the WhatsApp group to remind everybody. But we will begin with the Mishnah Kritot next Wednesday at 7 o'clock. And
And
Yasher Koach to everyone who has finished Yevamot. I know it wasn't easy, but we got there. And I look forward to moving on.
And Rabbi, is that going to be live class?
Oh, thank you. Thank you for reminding me. So yes, I need to take a quick temperature. Temperature, health, blah, blah. Anyway, next week, I will be back at the synagogue for our Wednesday Magal, our Wednesday school. And that means if people are interested, I could hold the class in person while still also doing live streaming for those that want to continue on Zoom or YouTube. If there aren't enough people that want to be there in person, then we can carry on like we've been doing and wait until people are more comfortable or have better schedules to be able to be there. So what are people feeling about that for next week?
I will be honest with you, Rabbi. The experience of eating dinner and not being a rush, and enjoying the dinner meal with my family, and not being a rush, for me is priceless. Like I really enjoy. I like it face to face, but the advantage of studying through Zoom and allow you to make your minutes at home more efficient, for me, it's very important.
That is true. I cannot argue with that. I know, Aaron, you'd be happy to be back in person. Does anyone else have a strong opinion one way or the other?
No.
A reminder that right now our policy does mean that in person we will still be wearing masks, if that makes any difference for how people are feeling. Well, I'm not hearing a huge rush to come back in person, so let's hold off at least until we finish off August. September, like I said, the month of Tishrei will be off because of the high holidays, and then maybe in October we'll have a different feeling about the in-person. So we'll continue Zoom only and YouTube for next week.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
All right, everyone, take care and be well.
My
Thank you.
daughters also say thank you.
Tell them they're welcome.
Thank you, Rabbi.